Millions of people will fall asleep to the sound of someone else's last moments. They will get into bed, put in their headphones, and let the story of a real murder carry them into sleep. A woman who was followed, a child disappeared, a family never made it home, and somehow those final hours now sit in the same category as everything else we stream for entertainment. That should bother us. Now, I'm not saying that crime should never be discussed. Some stories need to be told, and some cases have been solved only because the public kept on paying attention. Some victims have only been remembered because someone refused to let their names disappear. But that is not much of true crime anymore. According to Edison research, 84% of Americans aged 13 and above consume true crime in some form. And among weekly podcast listeners, true crime is almost the third most listened to genre. This is no longer occasional reporting. It is a mass market industry built on real suffering. And that matters because once tragedy becomes a product, the goal quietly changes. The question of this is no longer how do we honor the truth of the people who died? It becomes how do we hold attention of the audience? My argument today is that the commercialization of true crime has become a predatory industry that glamorizes violence, exploits victims and their families, and slowly teaches the rest of us to consume pain without actually feeling it. And this exploitation begins with the matter of scale. True crime is everywhere now. It is on Netflix, Spotify, YouTube, TikTok, on every platform that has the same ugly lesson that tragedy is profitable. Edison research found that 89% of weekly podcast listeners have binged true crime podcasts. And binge culture changes the way stories are built. They have to be suspenseful, they have to be addictive, and they have to end on a cliffhanger. Would already be really troubling if these were fictional stories. But they're not. They're real people, and real people do not fit neatly into episodes of structure. And so the industry reshapes them. The victim becomes the setup, and the violence becomes the hook, and the killer becomes apparently the most interesting person in the episode. We hear about his motifs, his childhood, his psychology, his darkness. And meanwhile, the victim is often reduced to a few smiling photos and a short description before the story rushes back to the crime itself. And that is not just bad storytelling, because it is genuinely just moral failure. A person who should be remembered for the lives they lived ends up being remembered mainly for the way they died. And if that were the only damage, it would already be enough. But the people forced to carry the heaviest burden are the families who were left behind. For us, this is an episode, but for them, it is the worst day of their lives, being replayed to strangers. Time reported on families who described feeling blindsided, shattered, and thrown back into grief when their loved ones' murders were turned into docuseries or books. Family described it as though they're treated as fodder, they're fuel for people's imagination. Just imagine that for a second. Imagine losing your daughter, your brother, your mother, and then seeing their death recreated with dramatic music, careful lighting, and a thumbnail designed to make people click. Imagine strangers debating the details online. Imagine hearing someone call the murder of the love of your life fascinating. That is not remembrance, that is intrusion, and it happens more often than people actually think. Because a 2025 study based on 20 in-depth interviews with co-victims, which are friends and families of victims, had been told through true crime media, found 5 recurring harms. Number 1, inaccuracies. Number 2, sensationalism, loss of privacy, harassment from the public, and loss of control over how the loved ones' stories were told. But this damage does not end with those families. It reaches further than that. It reaches us. Because when violence is constantly packaged as entertainment, something in the audience starts to shift. We get used to hearing about horrors that should stop us cold. We begin to talk about murder cases the way we talk about prestige television. Oh, you have to watch this one. This one's really insane. It's really good. Listen to that language. Is that the language of true compassion? No. That's just the language of consumption. And once the destruction of a human life can be recommended as good content, we're no longer just learning about violence. We're learning about how to live comfortably beside it. We're learning how to turn somebody else's suffering into atmosphere. If that is what this industry has done to our empathy, then fixing it will take more than a personal discomfort. It will take structure. The first place of reform that has to happen is at the level of distribution. Platforms like Netflix, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts should adopt a more ethical code in their distribution policies. If a production wants to access to millions of viewers, it should have to meet the basic standards first. That documented attempts to consult the victims' families, limits on graphic sensationalism, and a refusal to glamorize perpetrators. And finally, clear disclosure of whether any money is going back to victim support. If a project refuses those standards, the platform should refuse to carry it. Because that is not censorship, it is just mere responsibility of these platforms. These companies already decide what gets amplified every day. They can probably decide that profiting from real trauma comes with conditions. The second part, then, is industry pressure. Production guilds and documentary organizations should create an ethical certification for true crime, so audiences can actually tell the difference between work that informs and work that exploits. Right now, the most successful project is often just the most addictive one. That should not be the standard. And then there has to be restitution with actual structure behind it. If a company profits from a real crime story, part of that money should go into a fund that supports trauma counseling, victim advocacy groups, shelters, and restorative justice programs. It shouldn't look like a vague donation when convenient. Rather, it should be a standard fee tied to distribution and profit. And finally, the audience has to stop pretending that we're passive in all of this, because we decide what gets spread, and we decide what gets rewarded. So we can stop feeding the worst part of this industry. We can stop hyping the most exploitative shows just because they are well-made. We can choose victim-centered reporting over immoral glorifications of killers. We can be more suspicious of media that ask us to be entertained by someone else's pain. Because behind every case is a person who never got to finish their life. Behind every polished episode may be a family still trying to survive what happened. And if our entertainment depends on reopening those wounds for profit, then the issue is not just what the industry is producing. It is what we have learned to tolerate. So the next time true crime is offered to you, do not ask only whether it is compelling, ask whether it is decent. Because entertainment should never come at the cost of someone's dignity, privacy, or peace. Thank you.